Melanie, the documentary Dance Me to the End of Time is a very deeply intimate and personal journey, but also a political one. It's covering your partner's journey with breast cancer in the last 4 years of her life, Nancy Diuguid. And it's also bringing in a whole political issue, which we're going to talk about in this interview. It took 16 years to make this. Why did it take so long?
Well, firstly, I think when a partner dies after a long time, you're in such a state of shock, and I wasn't ready to do anything. The footage had been recorded as a sort of a home movie, as a way of remembering, because I think you're in autopilot when you're going through that process. And it felt important to record that both for myself and for my son. And it took a few years before I started to look at the footage. And then I think I realized that it was going to be a very personal film, and I needed it to have some scientific backdrop, some scaffolding to peg it onto. And it was only in 2015 where two things happened. An American scientific study proved that what Rachel Carson had been saying 60 years earlier was correct, that in utero infancy and early childhood exposure to DDT meant that women were 5 times more likely to get breast cancer by the age of 50. That was the first part of concrete evidence. And then also there was the San Diego Monsanto legal case, which proved that pesticides was causing cancer, and they had to pay out a huge amount of money. So the evidence was beginning to sort of come to fruition, that there was evidence to back up a film. It wasn't just me basing it on assertions and assumptions.
And that's one of the really interesting parts of this film, because it's not just this journey to death and to the final days of a very celebrated life of a theatre director, but it's also really raising these issues around what causes cancer and who is liable. So when that court case happened, it gave you license. And then what happened? Because you're sitting with this footage and that footage and now validation. What was the process?
The process then was to look for footage of Rachel Carson, because it was always very important to me to have her in the film. I didn't realize that usually it was after 50 years it became public information and it became into the public sphere. But in America, they changed it to 70 years. So it was extremely hard to get that archive. Her literary agent didn't want to release it at all, and we had to wait for almost a year to get that. So that held up the film. So it was a matter of just spending time going through. Thank goodness for digital media. You can sort of go through and find stuff on internet that you couldn't have done years before. When I used to make films before, that was impossible. You'd spend days in the archives and slowly trying to piece the film together. And it was a very much trial and error. The film, obviously, like all films, takes its own direction, and you've got to just go along with it. You can't impose what you want on it. You know what you want to say, but then it will just take you where it needs to go.
And that's the next question. How did you actually film this? You've spoken about archive material. There's some candid shots. There's a whole variety of footage pulled together. What did you actually use?
Well, while Nancy was alive, I had a Sony PD100, which is a fairly basic camera, but very lovely and small and compact, so it's not very intrusive. And then, so all those sort of, the filming of her during those 4 years was done on that. Then I think from 2018, when I started thinking more seriously about the film and needing footage, I was using everything I could get my hands on, from cell phones. I went to interview people in 2019 in England, and there was beautiful nature shots. And I just used my cell phone to take those, and cell phones are fantastic quality-wise. So I used that. I had an old Canon. There was really no special camera at all. And I'd never really filmed before, so this was a first. So I think it was a lot of beginner's luck, really, that things were vaguely in focus.
And then, of course, building Nancy's life, because she was in front of camera so much and she was a public figure. You have interviews from Carte Blanche, you have interviews from all over. Building that aspect of such a public and celebrated figure, how did you pull all that stuff together? And was that very healing for you to revisit all of her adventures?
I think two things. I think I had the most wonderful editor, Tanya Sellis, and it was just great working with her. She was determined that I should be in the film. I really thought it was a film about death and dying and Rachel Carson and pesticides. To begin with, I saw no reason why I needed to be in the film, which I kept saying, but the film demands you to be part of it. So eventually she convinced me, and that she was absolutely right. What was the second part of your question?
Just about the celebrated life of Nancy and how there was so much footage about her. Did that make it easier?
Oh, of course, because I mean, I had limited footage, so it was just wonderful to be able to use that. Expensive, but wonderful.
Again, this crossing of the camera, because it's a fascinating documentary in that many of the times you are filming Nancy, you're asking the questions, so you are very much a part of that. And really, what was that like for you? Did you film it with the view that this may end up being public, or was this just a very private journal you were making of the times?
At the time I was filming Nancy, it was a record. It was for Desmond, it was for myself, just to have that memory, because I think memories fade and dim, particularly if the people aren't there to share them with. And it was to have a record of that. But I think from about 2015, I began to realize this could be a film about death and dying, to bring death and dying from behind the shadows and to actually bring it into the foreground and to start talking about it. And I think that's why Nancy, when I look back on it, I think she kind of imagined something like this would happen. I feel quite strongly about that.
What was one of the most difficult aspects of the making of this, the cutting of the film, of putting it all together?
I think having to relive it all.
And there's also the very delicate line that the film walks, which is showing the dignity of Nancy, and also showing the hardness of the fight against cancer and the really human cost of it. And how was that difficult for you to kind of show her in these very vulnerable and sometimes humorous positions?
Yeah, I think I wanted to make a film about death and dying. It felt important. It felt that that's such a taboo subject that we all hide away from it. And that felt one of the driving forces. And therefore, you can't hold back. You've got to be prepared to go the whole way. But at the same time, you've got to balance that with dignity and respect and integrity. So the whole time you're sort of testing and judging, am I going too far? But you've got to go that extra step. So it was a constant battle of looking and rethinking and then thinking, it's okay. And I spent many sleepless nights thinking, am I going too far? And perhaps some people might think it was an intrusion, but I feel if you are wanting to bring a subject like that to people's front of mind, that's just the way it has to be.
You know, and this entire documentary really just shows such a great love affair between the two of you. Just tell us a little bit about how the two of you met, because this was a different era. This is where coming out and openly saying you're a lesbian was very controversial. And Nancy stood on these stages and really shouted it out and owned all this. So tell us about those beginnings of the relationship, the theatre companies.
I think she was extremely brave and courageous. I've thought about this a lot. I think fewer people in the 70s and 80s went out with the intention of, I'm going to be an activist. I think you just had the courage of your convictions and you stood up for what you believed in, and then you were called an activist. But I don't believe people went out and said, you know what, I'm going to be an activist. What do I have to do that? You just became an activist because you believed in what you believed in, and you felt you had to expose the world to what you thought was true and undermine conventional wisdoms. So I think that's really how it came about.
And again, though, this, stepping out with this all lesbian theatre company, there was a lot she did out there in the world. Were you a part of that era of her life? When did you connect?
We met in the 80s. I was a political documentary filmmaker, so she was sort of more in the arts and I was more in politics. And that was a fabulous combination because I think we both learned so much from each other. We had done very similar things. She had done a theatre piece on lesbian mothers. I'd done a documentary on lesbian mothers. And there were various other things that we had connected on. She had done the theatre piece for Amnesty International. I'd done a film for Amnesty International. So without knowing each other, our paths had crossed in different ways.
There's a scene in the movie, and we've spoken about this, in which she is taking us to the garden in the Cotswolds. Apart from just growing up in this pesticide belt in Kentucky, Nancy was very, very involved in organic eating and health, and very conscious of this. How much of a role did that play in her general life?
Vegetarian. She didn't drink tea or coffee. She didn't drink alcohol. She loved cakes. Terribly healthy, terribly athletic, terribly fit. I mean, drank water all the time, even before it was sort of popular to drink water. Terribly health conscious, and she always said it came from having grown up on a farm and seeing what DDT had, what spray cropping had done.
And
she would do things like swim to save the whales, and anything to sort of anything nature focused.
There is a scene towards the end of the movie. It's actually quite a lump in the throat moment, in which you really sit down with her. You're behind a camera, and I don't know if it is a cell phone camera, and you really speak about having the hard conversation about her dying. How was that, and what was your thinking? You speak about the safety of having a camera in front of you when you actually approached that.
Camera felt like having a third party, a bit like going to therapy and you've got a therapist there. It was a mediator, and I think that was extremely important, because I don't think either of us knew what to expect. So somehow the camera was just it was like a container to hold you both. And I think it did work in that way, but it felt that you had to have that conversation. She had to be allowed the time to express what she was feeling. I would have felt very guilty if I'd sort of colluded with the silence. So often people do. Susan Sontag's son writes about the fact that Susan Sontag wouldn't accept her death, and he colluded with it completely and never challenged her. And then you feel very guilty about denying somebody that experience. So I think it just felt it was extremely important to do that.
There's also such an interesting parallel set up between Rachel Carson's and her lover, Dorothy. And Rachel herself dying of cancer and keeping the kind of almost the secret, as you would say, because she was wearing a wig in a lot of the Senate commissions she was attending. And that really brings in the last a very magical and lyrical feeling to the movie. What was the tone you were feeling you wanted to set with this movie? And did it play out?
Well, I think when I first started thinking of the film, it was music that I first knew the kind of music I wanted.
Just move a little closer to the camera or the microphone. Yeah.
Right. I started off, then the music set the tone. The Hilliard Ensemble, Gorecki. There was just certain pieces of music that I knew that was the feeling I wanted to capture. I wasn't aware that I was going to be allowed to use the letters of Rachel Carson's and Dorothy, just forgotten her surname for the moment, because I thought that those would be private. Although the book had been published in 1994, I knew how difficult it was to get Rachel's writing, so I thought that would be out of bounds. So it was just very fortunate we were able to get it in the end.
And who was the narration of the voice of those letters between the two? Again, your microphone is a little bit
yeah. Susan Danford, who was a friend of Nancy's and is a wonderful actress based in Cape Town, and she did the voiceover of Rachel reading from The Silent Spring.
Now, Melanie, tell us a little bit about, you've been running Big Fish, the teaching theatre and filmmaking, digital filmmaking. How have you had to use what you teach in this documentary, which you haven't filmed on for a while? So you're now going back into that frame of crafting a story. Did it shift the way you actually made a documentary, having taught so long? And
I think it made me more courageous, in that I think one of the things with all the mentors at Big Fish, we used to insist that the young filmmakers learned how to make films about themselves and expose themselves. because if you wanted to talk to other people and you wanted them to expose themselves, you had to know what that felt like. And I felt, we've been teaching this, I actually do need to do it. So when Tanya was saying you need to be part of the film, and I was sort of recoiling and saying, it's not who I am, she just said, but it's not a film with art to you. And I suddenly thought, okay, this is what we've been making the students do. I've got to do it. And that's really how that sort of came about.
And that's quite a transition from somebody who's always behind a camera or calling the shots from the distance to actually be in that space. And then I think finally, Melanie, I mean, if Nancy was up there watching the movie, what do you think she would be saying about this, feeling?
I think Nancy educates the wrong word. She loved to push people to think about the world differently. And I think if it does make you think about death and dying differently, which I think COVID has also made us do, I think the fact that people had to think about writing wills or how they wanted to die and then maybe how they wanted to live. And then I think also about how understanding the interconnectedness of nature, how with COVID in particular, human activity has been so reduced and nature's flourished again, be it plant life, marine life, or animal life, all coming back again. If we can just make those connections and understand, I think she'd be very thrilled if the film could make those connections for people. Well, I hope so.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.